So what is up, guys? Your boy Brandino is back, and today I'm going to be talking about my Marvel theory about the movies that didn't do good or not great when they initially released, and I'm also going to be explaining a little more in detail about what I'm trying to say here later on, and giving examples as well, just to kind of help you guys understand what I'm talking about. So, as we know, the MCU officially started in 2008, and so that is kind of when people's mindsets might have changed to what I'm going to be talking about. And what that is basically people started to think in a different way. So after Iron Man 1 obviously released, that was the start of the MCU. More movies got announced and eventually released, which obviously caused for people to want to watch more MCU movies. But as we know, a lot of other Marvel movies were still released that were not MCU product movies. They were Marvel movies because they had Marvel characters, but they were not true Marvel movies. For example, the Amazing Spider-Man movies, the Sony Spider-Man villain movies as well. Both of those are just examples, and obviously one of the worst movies from what I've heard and seen, the 2015 Fantastic Four movie. All of those are examples of movies that were Marvel movies but were not a part of the MCU story, timeline, universe, whatever you want to call it. And so, today's theory / video and whatnot, I'm going to explain why I think that those movies did not do very well at their time. Now, I am also aware that some of these movies are just poorly made and are legitimately trash, so I'm not going to sit here and say that every single one of these movies is the most underrated movie of all time, or the 2015 Fantastic Four movie is secretly a great movie and everybody's just been hating on it for all these years. That's not what I'm trying to say. I'm just trying to make a theory on why I think there might have at least been an added flopping to these movies, and if this X, Y, and Z kind of theory type of idea that I have was not a thing, I think these movies might have maybe still been really bad, or at least some of them might have still been really bad, but less bad, if that makes any sense. So, basically, what I'm just going to start and saying here is, so as I said before, and as we all know, the first MCU movie was 2008 Iron Man, and that movie, very good movie, and it set up the MCU very nicely. A very good movie to start off, a very good character to start off with, but once that movie was released, the MCU became synonymous with Marvel in movies. That was what people started to picture Marvel movies as, more so in their brain. And if it wasn't necessarily after that movie, it would have at least been in a few short years, or in a few years. So, movies that came out that were not MCU byproducts, or MCU movies, thus, they started to get less reception. They started to get less attention by Marvel movie viewers because they thought, okay, I'm just going to wait for the next MCU movie because it has meaning to the other Marvel movies and what I now consider a Marvel movie, which is what is in the MCU. So why would I go out of my way to watch a movie that may have a Marvel character or Marvel characters if it doesn't have any connection or implications on the MCU, on the main timeline. I may really like this character or multiple characters in this movie, but I'll just wait and hope that maybe Marvel will eventually get those characters, or just kind of watch what they have and enjoy that and maybe develop a new favorite character. At least for the time being, and maybe if my old favorite characters do return, then they can be my favorite characters again in Marvel, but that's kind of what is the basis of my theory here, is I think people, they stopped associating those non-Marvel movies as Marvel movies in the same way they would have, at least, prior to the start of the MCU. And so, that's why The Amazing Spider-Man 1 and 2 maybe didn't do so well at the time, and maybe just weren't always considered great movies. But the reason I think that this theory can be proven to be true is because of Spider-Man No Way Home. As we all know, or at least we all should know, in Spider-Man No Way Home, Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man, which is the Amazing Spider-Man guy who played Spider-Man in those movies, he showed up in Spider-Man No Way Home and had a pretty big role. Some of his villains, I know at least one of his villains showed up, and he was important in that movie, to say the least. And so, because of that, he obviously was good in the movie. He tried not to spoil stuff. That's all fine and dandy. But what also came out of that is people started to go back to those movies. Those movies got better reception. And I've even seen some people since then saying, hey, these movies weren't as bad as we originally thought. Now, obviously, they still have their issues. No one's going to disagree on that. There's still issues, but that's obviously every movie. No movie is perfect. If there was a perfect movie, everybody would be watching it on repeat. So, you can't have a perfect movie, so there's always going to be issues. But people started to realize, hey, this movie maybe doesn't have as many issues as we originally thought, or hey, this movie isn't as bad as we originally thought. We were over-hating this movie because it was not a part of the MCU, potentially. I think that my theory makes sense with this movie and that character, just because we saw it get better reception and just more attention in general after that cameo and movie of No Way Home came out, which was an MCU movie, because it gave the Amazing Spider-Man movies an implication or a connection to the MCU, which is something it didn't have at its release point. And so that gave people a reason to actually go back and watch it, or watch it again, or watch it for the first time, whatever their case may have been. That gave them a reasoning to watch it. It gave them a reason to think, okay, this movie is important to me now because this character, the Spider-Man from that movie, showed up in an MCU movie and had a beneficial role. But even if he just had a cameo, I think the same thought process would have applied. Just because, again, it would mean that his universe is connected to the MCU timeline. It has an implication. It has relevance on the MCU timeline. Therefore, there's more incentive for people to actually go and watch the movie, unlike before, where it didn't have that, so people were less inclined to watch that movie, and people might have thought, okay, I'll just watch this if I have free time, or I'm not going to watch this at all. So the whole story shifted to a different narrative of, okay, now I have at least one reason why I should watch this, maybe more, but just the main reason would be it has a connection or an implication on the MCU timeline, which I consider Marvel movies too now, because that's what most Marvel movies are, and it's just the synonymous thing. Marvel movies are the MCU. The MCU became synonymous with Marvel movies. So if there was no connections or implications, people did not necessarily see it as a necessary movie to watch anymore. So, the 2015 Fantastic Four movie. That movie, as far as we know, because technically no cameos have happened, doesn't necessarily have a true connection. The only connection to the MCU has is that by technicality, the MCU owns that movie now, because they own the Fox movie Marvel IPs, or they own those characters again. So they could hypothetically make an appearance, but I doubt, because that movie did so bad, that any of those characters will. So they're kind of irrelevant. And as for the Sony villains and those types of movies, again, I don't think those movies are necessarily going to get much more attention, especially not a whole lot of positive attention. The only ones that I could see maybe getting some cameos are the Venom movies, where somehow we get Venom back, or some variant of Venom, and we say that it's an offshoot of that universe, or that it has a connection to the Venom Sony universe, or we get the Carnage from that universe, or something of that nature. That's the only thing that I could see possibly working out there. And even that is kind of a stretch, to say the least. But that's the only one of those that I could see, and those movies did do fairly well. So I'm not going to sit here and say that those are necessarily bad movies, but I just thought I would point that out, that those are probably the only ones of the Sony villain movies that will have any chance of getting a true MCU connection. Maybe some of the Spider-Man villains too, I guess, because they are simply just Spider-Man villains. They could have some connection, but again, I highly doubt it. And yes, I know they're all Spider-Man villains, mostly, besides Madam Web. That movie was absolute trash. If they do anything with that, we're all just cooked. But that's besides the point. So, the point that I'm trying to make here is the MCU became synonymous with Marvel movies. And so anything that wasn't MCU related was no longer considered a must-watch movie for Marvel movie fans, because it wasn't the MCU and it had no implications or connections to the MCU, so people felt it was not a must-watch movie, even if it might have been a very, very good movie. Less people watched it because less people felt a need or felt it as a necessity to watch, or a must-watch movie, however you want to phrase that. That's up to you, but that is kind of what I think on the matter. The MCU became synonymous with Marvel movies, and because there were Marvel movies that weren't a part of the MCU and had no implications or direct connection to the MCU, people felt less inclined to watch them. They felt, this movie is not as relevant to me. I can just wait until the next MCU movie comes out, and maybe I'll watch this movie if I have free time and there's not another MCU movie coming out for a long time, kind of like what we have now with the gap between the Fantastic Four First Steps, which just recently came out, and Avengers Doomsday, which is the next movie. We have like a year or two gap in between the movies. So we kind of have a lot of time to wait. So going back and watching older movies that maybe aren't technically MCU movies, by definition or by timeline, is not a bad thing to do now, because it gives you a Marvel movie to watch. And then you also don't have to watch the same Marvel movies over and over and over that you may have been watching since 2008. Over and over and over, potentially. Or even if you've only watched each one once, you kind of might be still keeping up with the story and all of that. So it kind of just gives you something real and something not too or something new to watch, rather. And so, I think that my theory here holds true because we literally see an example of it sort of playing out in the opposite way of once a movie had a connection, it got more reception, it got more attention, and from what I understand, it actually got more positivity lent towards itself with The Amazing Spider-Man 1 and 2. Now, obviously, like I said, people still have their complaints with that movie. That's never going to completely go away because it's not a perfect movie by any means. But that being said, the movies have been getting more attention since Spider-Man No Way Home in 2021 because Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man showed up in that movie, proving that that is a part of the MCU timeline now, and that that movie has implications and connections and whatnot on the MCU. So therefore, there's an actual, real reason to watch it. So it can be considered, at least to some degree, a must-watch movie, especially if people are realizing, hey, it's maybe not as bad as we thought. This is a must-watch movie, or this is a movie you should really watch, and whatnot, and just something to watch in your free time while we don't have a whole lot of anything to watch Marvel-related besides some of the shows that they might choose to pump out here and there. But other than that, that's kind of what the whole theory is. And if this theory still doesn't make sense, I'm going to give you a few other non-MCU related examples here just to kind of reinforce the point, because I do think it's important that people understand this theory, and you don't obviously have to agree with it. I understand that not everybody's going to agree with this theory. People are going to say, no, any movie that did bad at the time just did legitimately suck, and the reviews are real, box office failures are real, and I'm not going to sit here and argue that with you, but I think it is important to understand that this at least definitely played a role in why those movies didn't do as good, and I think it's important that this idea gets known to people, and it's at least something that people are aware of as a possibility, and something that we could potentially see be proven more often as we get more movies and more cameos and whatnot in the MCU with these other movies, obviously. So, this, to use a different example, would be very similar or identical, practically, to, let's say, Microsoft told Sony or Nintendo or some random company that they could make an Xbox console. Less people would buy that Xbox console, not because, they don't think it's necessarily an Xbox console in the sense of, okay, it's literally an Xbox console, yes. But people have associated Xbox to Microsoft. So because Microsoft isn't making it, isn't promoting it, less people are more inclined to buy it because it's not coming from the typical source that produces that content. The same thought process could be translated to my theory. Because these Marvel movies, so the Amazing Spider-Man movies, or 2015 Fantastic Four, or Spider-Man villain movies, or any other movies that came out after the release of the MCU that I might be missing, because those movies were not MCU movies, and the MCU is what people associated Marvel movies to primarily, people did not think to necessarily go out of their way to watch these movies, or to even necessarily talk about them, or think about watching them. Or if they did watch them, they might have went in with a more preconceived notion of this movie doesn't matter, so they weren't able to truly enjoy the movie at the time of the release. But now that some of these movies do have connections, like the Amazing Spider-Man movies, those movies are getting better reception, more attention, and at least a little bit more positive feedback around their space, around their movie. So they're getting more positivity, they're getting more reception, and they're getting at least somewhat maybe better reviews, not in the sense of not the official reviews, but more people are seeing them with a positive eye, a positive outlook. So the movie is getting some better promotion and just more out there for good reasons and not for bad reasons. Now, again, obviously, I know that not every movie is going to get that positivity vibe just because someone came back to it. I understand that, but I think it's just important to, again, note that it is definitely possible, and that because some of these movies have connections to the MCU now, have implications on the MCU, they're going to get more positive reception, at least from a few people, which will, at least again, just make them be looked at with a slightly more positive eye, and just maybe get more people to feel like this is something to watch, especially in a time, like I said before, like right now, where there's not going to be an MCU movie for at least a few years or so. So it just gives people something to watch, which is very important in keeping Marvel alive during this kind of dead zone of movie content. And so now I'm going to transition to another type of variant of this theory. It's the same theory, except it applies to a different movie. And then I'm also going to say something else at the end of this video, just so you guys can feel like you're a part of this in some way. So, the last part of this theory is the MCU and Iron Man in specific, primarily, were announced in 2006. And because those movies were obviously not technically made yet, Iron Man wasn't made, and nothing else for the MCU was made, all the other Marvel movies at the time were still synonymous with Marvel movies for the most part. But 2006, like I said, Iron Man is announced, and if you knew where to look, you could also find that they were planning to make it a cinematic universe. And a certain movie came out in 2005, The Fantastic Four. The 2000s Fantastic Four movies that did pretty good. Now, they were not necessarily as good as the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies with Tobey Maguire and that cast and movies. They weren't as good as that, but from what I understand, at the time, they did do very good in the box office. So they made the 2005 movie, and that did very good, at least at the box office. Then Iron Man and MCU is announced in 2006. And then they make a movie for the Fantastic Four, Fox, that is, in 2007. And although that movie still did pretty good, it did do worse. And some people are going to say, oh, that movie was just bad. And I'm not going to sit here and argue with you if that's what you think. So be it. Now, from what I've seen, I don't think it looks terrible. But to apply my theory, I think the idea of my theory still applies here as well. People, although maybe not quite yet, were already starting to associate Marvel movies to the MCU if they heard about that. And because of that, that movie became less well received. It was received in a worse light, and less people felt an inclination to watch it. And, oh, I can just wait another year or so and wait for Iron Man and the potential for a cinematic universe. So that kind of made that movie do worse. And also, another thing to note is that announcement in 2006 could have scared the development team and possibly made them rush their productions and spend less money in an effort to just get the movie out faster, which would also decrease the quality or just make the movie a tad bit worse than maybe they envisioned from the start, so they could obviously have suffered from that as well. But none of that would have happened, hypothetically at least, if the MCU/Iron Man 2006 announcement didn't happen, or they were told that their movies were going to be included. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that I think Marvel should have included those movies. I think it is good that Marvel didn't include a lot of those earlier movies in right from the start and eventually made their own variants of those characters for the MCU so they could tell their story in a unique way that would tie more into the MCU storyline. I think that is ultimately a good thing. But it definitely did hurt those movies. And it also just, again, reinforces my theory that those movies were not synonymous anymore with Marvel in movies because they weren't MCU movies. So that really just tanked the way people looked at them, the way they were perceived. And I think there was just a misperception of these movies. And now the people are going back to them. They're able to look at them in a more positive light now that there is more connection. And even with those 2000s Fantastic Four movies, although it is through a somewhat loose connection, there is still a connection with the Deadpool and Wolverine movie, which came out about a year ago. Actually, I think it literally is a year ago if I do my math correctly. Give or take a bit, obviously. I might be slightly off because I don't remember exactly when it left theaters. But there is a cameo with a character from that movie. From the 2000s Fantastic Four movies. I won't spoil what character if you haven't watched it. If you haven't watched the Deadpool and Wolverine movie, I definitely do recommend watching it. It's a very good movie. One of the best movies that I've watched, especially of recent times. A lot of swearing and violence, but it kind of uses it in a funny way. So I think that is still good. Not obviously that they're doing it. I wish they wouldn't. I wish they would use other words, but preferably. But I understand that that is sort of a part of Deadpool, especially as a character. So I understand it. And at least they used it in a way that was not super duper harmful. Obviously the violence was harmful to the characters in the movie, but somewhat, depending on how you look at it. But the swearing was more used as humor for the most part. But again, there is a cameo from the 2000s Fantastic Four movie, that's all I'll say, in the Deadpool and Wolverine movie. So that's all I'll say on that. 2000s Fantastic Four movie had a cameo in that movie. Now, I want to open up the comment section to also your theories. I want to see what you guys think, but obviously don't just paraphrase or say basically the exact same thing that I said, because I want to hear your true opinion. I don't want to hear somebody or see somebody, I guess, saying the exact same thing that I said, just with different wording. Because if you're not coming up with your own idea for this, I feel like it's not really worth your time. Now, you could say something as simple as, I just think any of those movies did bad. That's fine, and I'm not going to say that I think you're wrong, necessarily. I would disagree with you for at least some of these movies. Obviously, there are also some that are also just legitimately bad, but I think even the ones that are legitimately bad, if they did have an MCU connection at their release, sure, they might still be really, really bad, but they still might have done just a tiny bit better with that connection or implication on the MCU timeline or movie universe or whatever you want to call that again, because there'd be more inclination to watch them because they would have been considered part of what was synonymously considered as Marvel movies at that point. So leave your own theories down in the comment section below, and that's going to do it for this video. I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye for now.